you could possibly encounter. So kind of the most common one that we'll practice is engine failure during flight. So here's a PDF of the checklist that we use in 9160 tail, and I'll just kind of start with it. So engine failure during flight. So you're still on the runway, you haven't taken off yet, and presumably you can at least stop without having too much of an issue. So the primary thing is, whatever would be common sense, just throttle back and then brake as much as you can. Anytime you're doing an off-airport landing, you want to secure the engine. And so what securing the engine means is pulling the mixture to idle, turning the ignition switch off, master switch off, so that your propeller is no longer spinning in case you tip over or anything like that. So if that was to happen, it would not be as big of an issue. So anytime you have an off-airport landing, you want to secure the engine. So that also applies to engine failure during takeoff roll if you're going to roll past the end of the runway. If you're not going to roll past the end of the runway, then that's no problem. And typically you're not going to have a full engine die out on you. It might just sound rough, and it's way better to abort takeoff, maybe do another run up, maybe not even fly that day, than to get shortly after takeoff and have a complete engine failure or be in flight later on. So engine failure immediately after takeoff, this is kind of the worst situation. What you want to do is you want to pitch for your best glide speed, so 60 to 65 knots, and you probably do not have time to turn around. A lot of people kill themselves in a stall spin situation whenever they try to turn back towards the runway. If they're doing a 180, you need a whole lot more altitude than you would think. Somewhere around 1,000 feet AGL is going to be what it takes to be able to do a 180. So if you're anything less than 1,000 AGL, it's probably a bad idea to attempt a 180 back to the runway. And so you just want to pitch for 60, 65. So that's your best glide speed, and just land somewhere out in front of you. So you can put out flaps prior to landing if you have time, so you land a little bit slower. And once again, you want to secure the engine if you have time. So mixture idle, fuel selector off, ignition switch off, wing flaps as required, and master switch off. Fuel selector off is probably the less important one on the securing the engine. I would probably put it as mixture, ignition, master. Fuel selector is always mentioned in the POH. It's why I have it listed here, but it's probably not necessarily the second item you'd want to do because there's still going to be fuel around. So it's just not as important. Next, we have engine failure in flight. This can be the primary one we are going to cover. And so the key here is pitch for 60 to 65 and then find a suitable landing area and set up for that landing area. So immediately you want to just restart. You want to try to restart the engine. So we can turn off fuel selector on both. Just make sure it's on both. Mixture full rich, carb heat on, primer in and locked, magnetos on both. So the primary way that the engine might possibly restart is either mixture or carb heat. Those would be the possible culprits that might actually restart your engine. So maybe you just lean the mixture back too much at cruise. And so by pushing it full rich, that fixed the issue. Maybe you had carb icing. So the carb heat added heat, melted the ice, and that was no longer an issue. Both of those solutions would solve the problem rather quickly. The carb heat, the primer in and locked, it might come out, so you just want to make sure that it does not throw too much fuel into the cylinders and cause an issue with too much mixture in there. And maybe you bump the key on the magneto, you turn to the left magneto, and your magnetos had messed up on you. So any of those situations might restart the engine, but the mixture and the carb heat are probably going to be the most likely ones. Since we have just two fuel tanks and we always feed from both, it's probably, a fuel starvation issue isn't going to be solved by swapping fuel selector. But if you're in an airplane that has two separate fuel tanks, maybe the issue is, that fuel tank's messed up, maybe you're out of fuel, or maybe just the lines running from it to the engine is clogged. So by swapping fuel tanks, you've solved that problem. So if there's no air restart, you want to transmit a Mayday on 121.5 or any monitored frequency and squawk 7700. So this is the emergency squawk code. So 7500 is the hijacking, 7600 is communication failure, and 7700 is the emergency squawk code, and then the VFR squawk code is 1200. So the primary thing is in any of these emergency situations is to aviate, navigate, communicate. So the first thing we want to do is we want to fly the airplane, and we want to fly the airplane all the way until we stop. So the primary thing is that we do not get ourselves in a situation where we get too slow and we stall the airplane because we're trying to stretch it to some, perfect landing point, when in reality we kill ourselves because we tried to just do a little bit too much. The first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we're constantly flying the airplane and the airplane is doing what we want. Second thing we can do is we can navigate. So maybe that means, navigating to some point. If you're flying from, Tuscaloosa to Selma, maybe that's just, navigating there. If it's an engine failure, maybe that's, navigating to the place that you think it's best for the engine failure situation. And then communication is going to be that radio call and squawking. It can be helpful, but there's not really much ATC can do in situations besides sending emergency management people to come help you out. Maybe that's the sheriffs, fire trucks, ambulances. So it's always nice to be able to let them know that you're having engine failure, but they're not going to be able to do anything to fix your engine in that moment. So that call would be like on guard, Cessna 9160 tail, and then just tell them where you are and what happened. So, I'm 15 miles to the south of Tuscaloosa. I had an engine failure, and then you just want to say on guard at end if you're talking on 121.5. If you're on some other monitor frequency like Tuscaloosa Tower, because you didn't want to put in 120.5, as long as it's a monitored frequency, somebody's going to be able to help you there. So in that situation, you just say Tuscaloosa Tower, Cessna 9160 tail, emergency aircraft, and then just give them the situation. So if you're in the pattern, emergency aircraft, I just had an engine failure, looks like I'm going to make it to the runway. And then whenever you have time, a passenger briefing. So that might be something like, meet me 500 feet behind the tail. We're going to open up our doors on short final, and I'm going to secure the engine on short final. If you had people in the back, you'd want to talk about who's getting out first, who's opening up what doors, and then securing the engine. So mixture mags, fuel selector off, master switch off, and seatbelt shoulder harness secure. So we want to make sure we have that shoulder harness on if we took it off for while we were cruising. And then any sharp objects we want to stow. And then we want to open up our doors. So we want to secure the engine whenever we know that the engine is not going to be helpful if it comes alive. If you have a complete engine failure and it dies for 3 minutes or so, and then it just comes back alive, it might only come back alive with half power. And if we're on really short final to an already short field, that might make us glide just a little bit too long. So we want to secure that engine, but kind of wait till the last moment. So just in case it does come back alive, we don't have to land in a field, because landing in a field is always going to be a pain, or landing anywhere else in an emergency situation is going to be the pain. So engine failure during startup. If it starts, just continue cranking, and maybe you can exhaust the fire. If it fails to start, you want to kill the mixture and continue cranking. Maybe you can kill it that way, or maybe you need to get a fire extinguisher and put it out that way. Engine failure during flight. This is going to kind of be the worst situation that you can encounter, because it's a fire and you're going to have to kill your engine for it, and you got to still land somewhere safe. So you're going to kill the mixture. You're going to turn off the fuel selector so that the fire no longer has the fuel that it had. And then master switch off in case there's an electrical issue, and then close your fuel and air vents so you don't get smoke inside the cockpit. And we're going to pitch to 100 knots so that we can try to exhaust the fire by just putting too much air into it. And then we're going to have to execute a forced landing. So while we're going down, maybe we don't want to go too low at 100 knots so that we can still, glide somewhere to a safe landing spot. Electrical fire during flight. Maybe there's some wires that somehow started a fire somewhere along the way. So we just want to kill the power running through those wires. So master switch off, all other switches except ignition switch off, just to make sure that there's no electricity running anywhere inside the aircraft. Turn off, close our vents and our air so that we have no smoke coming inside the cockpit. And then get our fire extinguisher out of the back seat of 9160 tail and, put it out if we have time. If the fire goes out and we need some of the electrical equipment, like, we need our GPS, we can turn it back on, check for any faulty circuit breakers, check, make sure that the fire doesn't restart, and we can leave it on and just keep an eyes out. If it restarts, we want to kill it again. We want to run through the checklist again, and then we can open up our vents and air after it's no longer an issue. Landing with a flat main tire, we just want to make a normal landing and touch down on the good tires and make sure that we do not put any pressure on the bad tires for as long as possible. Over voltage light, so we're going to turn the master switch off, turn it back on, see if the voltage light comes on or off again. If it does come on again, we might want to think about landing sometime soon, because we're going to lose all of our avionics. So we're going to lose our GPS, we're going to use VORs, and we're going to lose radio. So we're going to have no way to navigate, and we're going to have no way to communicate. So we might want to go ahead and land before it comes into an issue. If Ammeter shows a charge, so maybe our alternator died, we want to turn our alternator off and turn all other electrical equipment off. You can try turning off your alternator you can turn it off once, turn it back on, maybe make sure the circuit breaker's not popped. And we want to turn off all non-essential electrical equipment, because at some point the battery is going to run out of battery. So the alternator charges the battery, and then everything feeds off of the battery. So at some point that battery is going to go dead. And what we don't want to do is it should go dead whenever we need it, because preferably we still have some radios working by the time we get to our destination. So if we're just cruising along on some cross country, we can just turn everything off, maybe occasionally turn on the GPS, make sure check our progress, and then whenever we get close to our destination, turn on our radios. And maybe we want to add the fact that, hey, we have an alternator failure, so we might lose radio communication at any point through the rest of our flight, just so that they're aware and they can be ready for that. So that's everything listed out on the checklist. Some other situations you might run into is you might lose radio communication. And so if you lose radio communication, maybe it's just our COM1 radio died. So what we can do is we can try to talk on our COM2. So here's an inside view of 9160 tel. And so by switching this switch that my mouse is over right now to COM2, that'll change where we transmit on COM2. That makes it so that we don't transmit on COM1, we transmit out on COM2. So we'd want to make sure that we have the proper frequency in on our COM2. And it's not quite as strong, and it sounds a little bit weird talking out on COM2, but just keep in mind it might possibly work. So if we lose COM1, we can always try COM2 first. So we just want to make sure that we're also listening to COM2 so we can hear back any responses that we might have. And we would just talk on that radio and we'd see if it works. In some situations, you might lose both. You're both COM1 and COM2. And in those type of situations, we don't know what part is broken. There's kind of three different scenarios. Either our transmit's broken, either our receive's broken, or both are broken. What we want to do is we want to act like none of them are broken. And we want to make sure, we at least want to act like our transmit is not broken. And we want to make calls just like we always would, because maybe somebody's able to hear us and they're still able to, get out of our way or give us some light gun signals that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So we can make those, we can act like our radio is working and still make our transmit calls. We can also use our cell phones. Maybe we have the tower's phone number, or whatever airport we're landing at, we have their phone number. We can let somebody know, and that way we can have some help that way. And then we can expect those light gun signals. So light gun signals that we can expect are going to be a steady green on the ground is cleared for takeoff. I would avoid situations taking off, without radios if it can be avoided. But, in the air, cleared to land. So really in the air, the more important ones, flashing green are going to be returned to land. And then steady reds give way to other aircraft. Flashing red is going to be airport unsafe. Flashing white doesn't apply. And then alternating red and green are going to be exercise extreme caution. Maybe once you're landed, you might expect a flashing green. Steady red, you might get stop. Flashing red, stop. Taxi clear of runway in use. So generally, if you're in the air and you actually have an emergency situation, you can expect a steady green clear to land. And then you're probably going to be cleared to taxi for whatever. They'll kind of put you in priority as long as they know that you are a radio communication failure. Sometimes they might not really expect that you have a radio communication issue, so it might take them a while to recognize it. But if we're coming in on a cross country or something like that, we squawk 7600 since we had that lost communication, since we had radio communication failure, we squawk 7600, and then a Birmingham approach or whatever approach is near Tuscaloosa can let them know, hey, we got an aircraft squawking 7600. It looks like they're going to you, so that they can kind of expect those light gun signals. If it's an airport that does not have light gun signals, like Bessemer, you don't legally have to talk on the radios, but it would probably be pretty nice. People are going to get mad at you if you do not. They're going to think you're just some idiot. They don't really realize that you're having a radio communication issue. So what you can do is just observe the traffic pattern and enter the traffic pattern and exercise extreme caution. And same deal if you're landing in a class, Delta, Bravo, or Charlie with radio communication failure, exercising extreme caution. You probably want to avoid those Charlie and Bravo airports for sure, and generally avoid Delta airports if you have lost radio communication issues. If we lose our GPS, then we got to use some other way to navigate. So that might be some other means of GPS navigation. If we have something like ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot installed, we might be able to use that to get our destination. Or if we don't, that's where those checkpoints are going to come really important. So we've at least got to get to some point to land. We got to, at least get to some airport and land there. So, maybe we just use our checkpoints and we just proceed to our destination. If it's an airport that we've been to, we're familiar with, it's not going to be hard for us to find, and we're pretty confident with our whole timing and finding checkpoints, we can do that method. We can also use any VORs that might be available to us. So we want to look on that map, see if there's any VORs we can fly to and fly directions off of it, or any radials that we can fly, that we can, find ourselves on, so that we can find the airports using VORs in case our checkpoints really got screwed up, or maybe we want to use some combination of our checkpoints and our VORs. Maybe we just left the airport. In that case, maybe turning around is the best answer. Let's not proceed with this flight. Let's just turn around, land at our airport, since we know where we are. We're a whole lot closer that way. Because the problem is, if you fly to some other airport, now you've got to get home with possibly a broken GPS. So sometimes the answer is just to go ahead and turn around. Then you want to really, let's say, you didn't make checkpoints to the flight. There is no VO and there is no VOR. You really just got to guesstimate distances at that point and just try to find yourself on the map. Guesstimate distances, use your E6B to figure out some timing to places, or just using your simple math to figure out timing and distance and headings while you're flying along. And whenever it comes to landing somewhere and you're not really sure, hey, what's 5 miles, just guesstimate some 5 miles marks. Maybe add the call on the radios that, hey, not exact. I lost GPS, but I think I'm about 5 miles, to the west or something like that. So we already talked about alternator failures on our checklist. But anytime we have an alternator failure, we got to proceed with caution, because at some point that battery is going to die. So what we can do is we can just turn off non-essential things and then turn them back on whenever we need them. And then we just want to land as soon as practical. So you probably want to, possibly avoid Class Delta airspace, but, since we always come back to Tuscaloosa, that's not really the case. But maybe if your destination's one, maybe pick a different airport, just depending on how your radios might work. So other situations you might just have some engine issues. Maybe you're cruising along, you kind of have a rough sounding engine. One thing, you might have just leaned it back too much whenever you ran through your cruise checklist. So if that's the case, just go ahead and advance the mixture full rich just to be safe, or just turn it in a little bit if it just kind of randomly started. We can change what the throttle setting is. Maybe we need to add and subtract some throttles. Maybe we're not inside that green arc. We can check the primer and mags, make sure our primer's not out, so that the cylinders are getting too much fuel. Maybe we pop the mags over to just the left mag, and that's running a little bit rough today, or maybe we had a mag issue. And we can also just look at our oil pressure and oil temperature, or any other gauges that we have in aircraft, and see if those are being rough to us. If it continues, maybe we want to go ahead and land, sooner than we planned, because the last thing we want to do is really have an engine failure, because we want to avoid engine failures, because they take some skill to deal with, and just a single thing can go wrong and you can be in a dangerous situation. So if you can, avoid situations where you have to, or where you're forced to land without an engine. So anytime you have any sort of emergency situation, do whatever makes sense to you, consult checklist, and always follow the principle of aviate, navigate, communicate. Because the last thing you want to do is, stall the aircraft, spin the aircraft low to the ground while you're trying to navigate at some point, to where, you might have been fine if you had not, stall spinned in that situation, but you did because you forgot that you got to aviate first, navigate second, and communicate third.